Welcome back, adventurers. Now, one of the hardest parts of world building, at least in my opinion, is that you can have the coolest ideas in the world, but writing them down and actually fleshing them out and turning them into something that you can use or reference can be extremely daunting. So today, I want to talk really quickly. I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. We're going to talk about how to make a proper timeline, or at least how I make those timelines, and hopefully it will help you with your process. Now, what I like to do essentially is to break everything down into 3 sections. Now, the first section is going to be things that everyone knows. So this is going to be recent history, right? Things that have happened within the last 100 years or so. This is also going to be common facts. So these are things like rules about magic, feelings that people have towards a local lord or towards political parties. They can be things that are mundane, right? Like, you know who your neighboring cities are, you know who your neighboring countries are, you know a lot about the local town that you might live in, even though you may not know very much about things that are going on in distant countries or distant lands or in the capital city if you're starting somewhere else. Now, what we're talking about here is going to be roughly 80% of your history's timeline. That's how I like to do it. And it should focus on things that have either affected the character directly or affected the world. If it hasn't affected the character, if it hasn't affected the world, it's probably not going to be something that these commoners, these NPCs are going to know, right? So when you're building your timeline, make sure that you're thinking about what are the biggest things that have affected them in the last 100 years. So again, if we're looking at our own timeline, right, here on Earth, in the quote-unquote real world, things that have happened in the last 100 years, well, we know that there's been a couple of world wars. We know that there's been 1, 2, maybe 3 world pandemics. We know of major technological strides that have been made in the last 100 years. So things like flight or space travel. We know that there have been great advancements in science and technology and in healthcare. We know that there have been a lot of ups and downs in politics, and thinking granularly on a deeper level, we also know that the average person is really only going to remember, like in my case or in your case, depending on how old you are, you're probably only going to remember between 20 to 40 years on average based on the people that are watching this before it becomes sort of way too far back for you to remember because you were too young or it happened in a previous generation's life, right? So that's what I like to do. I like to make the meat of my timeline all about the things that people will have remembered if you were to, say, hypothetically jump into the brain of an NPC from this world. That is going to be the most important things because that's where you're going to get all of your information for your world building. This is where people are going to be asking questions. They're going to be pulling on things. Well, what happened here? What happened 20 years ago? What happened 15 years ago? Who were the important people that were on the planet, were running the show, that were calling the shots? What warriors, what wars have happened? How many countries have risen and fallen in those 100 years? I mean, just think about how many countries have come and gone in the last 100 years in our own world, right? So thinking about it like that, you can really start to see how 80% of your timeline is really going to be the majority of everything that you're going to need to know in order to run a campaign or build a world. And on top of that, we get most of our info through word of mouth from our families and our schools. So if it's more than a generation or two out, it becomes muddy. It's difficult to know truth from fiction. And the farther out you go, the less reliable history gets because it was written with biased hands in different times. And that's something I like to make sure that I'm always thinking about, because the farther out, if we're talking about building a timeline and you drop something 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, well, 1,000 years ago in our own world, it was a completely different world with completely different rules, different structure as far as who was ruling the world at the time, very, very different times. So I like to keep that in mind and try to build things, the 80% that I'm building here, to just, again, be within that last 100 years. That's just how I like it. You can do however you want. This is what works for me, right? I'm trying to make it easier for myself. Now, really quick, I do want to just take a moment to say thank you to today's sponsor, Describe. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I am constantly tripping over my own words. So how do you do that without spending your entire session prepping notes and prepping things for you to read? How do you bring your world to life? Well, that's where Describe comes in. Now, to really help you understand that, here's a minor illusion to perfectly explain it. Wait, it's not working. Why isn't it? Okay, let's just use Describe. Describe is a massive, professionally written library of descriptions, NPCs, locations, monsters, spells, magic items, and entire scenes ready to drop right into your campaign. And what's cool is that you can search by keyword or filter by vibe, such as dark, romantic, or cursed, and it even integrates with your VTT so you're not having to scramble mid-session. And what I love the most is that you can add your own notes, you can pair entries with music and maps and ambience and sound effects all in one place. So if you want to try it for yourself, check out Describe and use my code FANTASY4 to check out. Yeah, that's more like it. Now, the second piece of that timeline is going to be things that only some people know, and this is going to be far off history, so things that have happened in the last 500 to 1,000 years. So this is stuff that you have heard about, or I should say NPCs have heard about, or your characters or your players, depending on what you're using this video for, right? These are things that you have heard about, or they have heard about, but probably don't know very much about. For example, you might have heard about the Romans and some things that they did 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And I mean, that's a testament to it in itself, right? Like, we're not even sure how long ago the Roman Empire was, but it was roughly 2,000 years ago, if my math is correct there. So you might have heard things about them and things that they have done, and you might have heard that they had these people that were these warriors, the famous warriors called gladiators, and they fought in these giant arenas around Rome, and there was one colossal arena called the Colosseum, and that they also at one time had somebody called Julius Caesar. But could you name the dates that they were around? Could you tell me what years Julius Caesar ruled from? Could you name some of the ancient gladiators? Maybe. You might have a few names, you might have some information, but in general, most people aren't going to be experts and most people aren't going to be thinking about that. Also, I'm just realizing that I am straight up thinking about the Roman Empire. Is that still a thing that people are talking about online? Now, what I like about this, and what I like about having information kind of thrown into the, the far off history, is that it makes your job easier as a world builder because there's room to make mistakes. When somebody says something in your world, for example, if you're writing a book and somebody says something and then maybe in another chapter you contradict it, or in a sequel you contradict it, it doesn't matter because you can be vague. People may know different things. You can easily backtrack and just say like, oh, well, that's what that person thought, or that's what that NPC thought if you're talking about D&D, right? Now, again, because we've already taken 80% of our timeline, that means that there's 20% left over for this, right? So this right here, this far off history, things that have happened in the last 1,000 years or so, or sooner, right? 2,000, 1,000 years. This is going to be 15% of your history, maybe up to 19%. Right? But that means, if you're good at math, what that means is that 1 to 4% that's left over is going to be our third thing. Now, these are things that are mostly forgotten. And this is honestly my favorite part about building a timeline, because the chances are you've already done this part. If you're like me, you probably have folders and folders of notes. You have Google Docs, you have notepads, whatever it is that you use. All of that shit that you spent so many hours doing, events from 10,000 years ago or more, your pantheons, talking about the gods, talking about ancient warriors, all of that is going to get crammed into this 1% of the timeline that's never going to get seen. And that's just the honest truth of it, that most of that information will never be known. Your readers aren't going to know this information. Your players are probably not going to interact with things that are no longer relevant to them. And they're not going to know information that happened this far back. We're talking tens of thousands of years, right? And so they're probably not even going to ask questions about those things. So unless you make a whole story arc around those things, this is information that your viewers, your audience, your players are never going to know about. And that's okay. That's really important for us to become okay with and to get a grip with. The last % of your timeline is where you can lay all of those foundations for those mysteries, for bad guys that you want to bring in, for ancient civilizations, for all the really, really cool stuff that you can use as story hooks for your chapters or your game or whatever. And the best part of that is that you really only need to know surface level information there, since all of that information is really not known by the average person. Any experts that you have in the world that are actively studying that information are probably still learning how to decode that, or trying to understand whatever existed in this time, or what this civilization was like, or what this ancient artifact was used for, right? It's all hypothesis, it's all theory. So that means you can be as vague as you want and just mention it, and now you've dropped a really, really good nugget of information for your world. And that's pretty much how I do my timelines. I used to spend so much time building my timelines. I used to spend so much time trying to flesh them out and trying to make sure that I knew every little aspect of what happened in the last 30,000 years. And unfortunately, as I've grown as a world builder, I realized that most people don't really ever get to know that information. And what is more important, and what helps me with efficiency and streamlining my writing process and my world building process, is knowing the specifics of things that are going to affect my main characters or my players. And that's just been how I work my timeline. So hopefully that helps you. I'm trying to keep this one nice and simple for you. I think that by breaking it down into those 3 pieces, into things that most people will know, things that some people will know, and mostly forgotten things. Those are the actual scientific terms for those independent groups. I think that just helps. Let me know in the comments down below if you think that there is a better method for breaking down a timeline. I'm sure there's people that have dozens of different methods. I'm sure that there's a lot of better methods. So let me know in the comments down below. I would love to know. Maybe you're helping me in that process, right? So, as always, thank you so much for watching. Forge on, my friends, and don't touch the artifact.
The preferred term is Master of the Mystic Arts. You can leave that now.
All right, wizard.